Thank you very much indeed. Professor Bergsten, dear Fred, thank you for hosting me today and for hosting all of us today, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Ulf, thank you for your kind words, much too kind. You know my character, and you should be much clearer when it comes to describe my character. Ambassador Shariot, thank you for hosting a dinner last night and for your kind words as well. And dear friends and ladies and gentlemen, I'm more than glad to see many friends here. And as it was Adam Posen who just said that before, I may quote him. He said, and I'm telling that all my friends from the foreign policy community, he just said before, Karl-Theodor, you have changed to the dark side now. And I certainly refuse to underline that very phrase, but it's a very challenging time. It's a very challenging period we're all in, and it's a challenging post. That's certainly true. And as I've just been described as being a troubleshooter, there are some. I always say he seems to be, but he escapes the trouble as soon as possible, because the last career steps were a bit fast, to say it very honestly. I actually feel tempted now to follow up with a couple of talks, and highly interesting talks I've had during the last 2 days, and I feel tempted to follow up and to give you my assessment on those things, and to hold a free speech here. And I'm usually tempted to hold free speeches, not to the sheer joy of my ministry, who always try to write me the pages and pages of speeches. As I've just went through the speech I got for today, I thought it really makes sense, and I should, for the first time probably since weeks now, read the speech. Not to bore those who are traveling with me now for the last 2 to 3 days, because actually for them it would be much more boring if I would repeat some of the things I've talked about during the last couple of days. But we have covered quite a variety of topics, of themes, and of issues, from the upcoming G20 meeting to, of course, the automotive sector. Some think that I'm only here to talk about cars. This is not entirely true, but we do talk about cars as well. And specifically meetings with General Motors, and this afternoon also with Secretary Geithner and Larry Summers will touch upon the future of the automotive sector. But we can come to this maybe in the Q&A session. And let me just start with a speech that has been written for me, and I think there are some points I would like to address to you and give you an impression of my thinking at the moment. So, first of all, my thanks also goes to Mr. Welschke, the representative of German industry and trade. Mr. Garzka I've already mentioned, and your generous contribution have made today's meeting possible. Thank you very much again. Ladies and gentlemen, a bright brain in Washington, I mentioned his name, it was Larry Summers, recently had this to say about the economic upheaval. With crises comes enormous fluidity in the system, and the transition from the inconceivable to the inevitable can be rapid. In a small way, the sentence even applies to me personally. And this is exactly what Ulf Garzka has just said before. Certainly in terms of speed, the way my political development turned out to be in the last few months has not coincided with my expectations. I'm not sure if job rotation is the right description, specifically after being just a Secretary General for the party for about 100 days. But certainly in my case, the German labor market has proved remarkably flexible. Ladies and gentlemen, it is good to be back. It is good to be among friends. And together, as friends, we are facing extraordinary economic challenges. Rarely, probably never since 1945, were these challenges, global challenges, and I pronounce the word global, more daunting than today. The world economy is in a critical state. Confidence in financial markets is damaged. And all major industrial nations are simultaneously in recession. The only way for us to overcome this very situation is by acting together. This may sound simplistic, ladies and gentlemen. This may sound, for some, maybe naive, but I think it's of urgent necessity. And that's why the decisions taken during the G20 meeting last November here in Washington are so crucial. First, continue efforts to stabilize the financial system. Second, recognize the importance of monetary support. Thirdly, use fiscal measures to stimulate domestic demand. And the last point, refrain from raising new barriers to investment or trade. In Washington, I am being asked, and not only once, how does Germany react to the crisis? And my answer is swift, resolute, and with a sense of proportion. And I said it in other occasions during the last 2 days as well, with a certain amount of realism, with a certain amount of pragmatism, and with a necessary amount of optimism as well. And some always look at a German speaker and say, is optimism really a word that can come out of the mouth of a German? Yes, it can. Coming back to the measures we have taken so far, our pact for employment and stability, I put that in quotation marks, we love to phrase such things, which we launched just a few weeks back, totals more than $60 billion. In total, all of our measures, including the automatic macroeconomic stabilizers, are providing a fiscal stimulus of $125 billion, or as the ambassador has already pointed out, 4% of Germany's GDP. I do repeat that because there are some rumors flowing around the city here as well that tend to state other things, and we have to make sure that this is not true. Therefore, I think it is fair to say that Germany does indeed contribute significantly to overcoming the global crisis. And I know not everybody here would agree to this. But frankly, I don't find this criticism justified. It is quite clear that we will not achieve the greatest success if each partner tries to do exactly the same as all the others, for example, in terms of timing, scope, and content. And what certainly doesn't help is a procedure or a culture of mutual finger-pointing in this time. The situation is different in each country, and so the responses have to be different too. It is important for every country to pull in the same direction, and that is indeed what is happening. And the same goes for both the USA and for Germany. The philosophy of our program is to strengthen both aggregate demand and long-term growth prospects at the same time. Accordingly, most of the money is dedicated to additional public investment in growth-promoting infrastructure, education and training, and to financing cuts in taxes and welfare contribution. It was a rather remarkable discussion we have had in Germany about financing cuts, specifically in taxes, but we made it possible. We have also put in place a $125 billion framework for loan guarantees, $125 billion framework, and this should help us to stabilize lending from banks to businesses and to avoid a credit crunch. It will help fundamentally sound and profitable firms to weather the crisis. And that's also one of the discussions we are leading right now in Germany, is the crisis the factor for a situation a company is in right now? Or is the crisis maybe just a reason to ask for help they probably would have needed anyway? And that's why we are discussing rather thoroughly about certain criteria we need in that situation. So Germany is thus making a significant contribution towards overcoming the global crisis, as was recently confirmed also by the IMF. And the talks I've had this morning with Dominique Strauss-Kahn and also with Bob Sully confirmed me in that view. The size of our stimulus package is thus clearly greater than the average of the G20 countries. In the short run, our measures will inevitably raise the fiscal deficit. This is creating challenges for us on both sides of the Atlantic. And that's why we remain firmly committed to keeping Germany's public finances on a sustainable long-term path. And to underscore this, we will anchor a new stringent debt containment rule in our constitution. And as you all know, that needs a two-thirds majority in Germany, in the German parliament, and specifically also from our second chamber, has to be underlined. Internationally, we have to take care that mounting public debt does not create volatility in interest and exchange rates. Therefore, other nations must also put their public finances on a sustainable footing. In times of crisis, ladies and gentlemen, it is very tempting to fence off one's own economy. And that is the wrong way. It only leads deeper into crisis, as is shown by painful experiences in the past. And our motto can and has to be, keep the bazaar open, and not keep the bizarre open at the moment. That was one sentence that was not written by my speechwriters. Open markets and freedom to invest are the foundations for growth and prosperity worldwide. For decades, ladies and gentlemen, we have all benefited together from the global reduction in trade barriers. My country, with its steep rise to become a global economic partner, is the best example of this. And that is why Germany is pressing especially hard to ensure that all the G20 countries stick to their promise not to set up any additional barriers to trade and investment. The current crisis must not be used as an excuse to fall back behind the current level of trade liberalization. And that is why we paid very close attention in our own stimulus program to ensuring that it does not give preferential treatment to domestic suppliers. There was an intra-European discussion ongoing for quite a while where some had to be convinced that this is the right way. And I believe that the Buy American clause in the US stimulus package does not adequately meet this criterion. And please allow this criticism. Yes, it is true that the Act also contains a passage which mentions expressly that it does not affect international trade commitments, which means, for example, that it would not affect EU countries. But surely, since the USA is a major player in global trade policy, it is only natural that it should comply with its own trade commitments. Why just restate the obvious? I fear that the Buy American clause could serve as a bad model for stimulus packages in other economies. The right way forward for the continuing liberalization of trade was, is, and will continue to be the multilateral approach of the WTO. The World Bank predicts that for the first time in a quarter of a century, world trade will shrink this year. And that is why a successful conclusion to the Doha round is more vital than ever. I wonder how much nostalgia and romanticism this very sentence will cause tonight when I speak to House and Senate members, but I will try my very best again. It would establish a foundation on which to rebuild the confidence of the markets. And a successful conclusion of the Doha round will generate additional global economic growth in excess of $150 billion a year. It's worth to repeat that from time to time. And that is why I'm calling for agreement in the Doha round before the end of this year. We have heard such calls before, but I repeat also such a call. And as I do so, I look to the USA for its support. It won't happen without it. At the April summit in London, at the April G20 summit in London, the leaders should send out a strong signal for a rapid conclusion of the Doha round. Furthermore, the financial markets also need to find their place on the international political agenda. Regulation was inadequate here, and that led to the current crisis. So we need to act, as was also the consensus at the G20 Financial Summit in Washington last November. At the meeting in London in a few days' time, the nations will need to act together once again. And I'm optimistic that I will find a good solution. To see just how powerful international trade is, you need only look at both sides of the Atlantic. We can now build on this, and we should build on this. The transatlantic market continues to be the backbone of the world economy, and we now need to strengthen it, and not only to paraphrase it again and again. No other economic regions maintain such close and all-embracing trade and investment relations as the US and Europe. And a few numbers might serve to illustrate the strength of our economic relations. Many of you know those numbers, but I think it's worth stating them. Every year, the transatlantic economy produces goods and services worth 4,000 billion US dollars. 4,000 billion US dollars. In total, transatlantic trade and investment provide a living for some 14 million people on both sides of the Atlantic. Together, the US and the EU create 45% of the world's GDP. At the same time, Europe and the US each conduct only around 20% of their trade with each other. That means, at the heart of our transatlantic economic relations are the direct investments in both directions. US investment in Europe totals 1,200 billion US dollar, or 53% of worldwide US foreign investment. And at the same time, the US remain the major destination for European investment abroad. Around 75% of all foreign direct investment in the USA comes from Europe. It's quite interesting. As soon as you enter a post in the government, you have to deal with numbers. I didn't do that before. Tariffs do not pose barriers between the EU and the USA any longer. So we now need to focus on the non-tariff trade barriers. We want to systematically cut them back. And that is a job of the Transatlantic Economic Council, the TEC, we've just talked on the table about it, which was established under the German presidency of the European Council. It enables us to bring into line different standards and regulations, rules which have so far imposed unnecessary burdens on companies and consumers. Together, the USA and Europe will be able to lead the world in setting global standards. The tech issues on the table account for $10 billion. And that is why I'm taking advantage of this visit to urge the new administration to join us in pressing ahead with the work of the Transatlantic Economic Council. I will also meet Mr. Froman this afternoon. As I've understood, he will be the counterpart of Günther Verheugen on the American side, and this is a step we very much appreciate. All that will enable us to further strengthen our economies on both sides of the Atlantic. A successful tech could be of considerable help in stimulating our economies on both sides. A successful tech would further strengthen economic ties that already are a model for success, and it would stimulate economic growth. And unlike with monetary and fiscal measures directed at overcoming the crisis, we wouldn't even need an exit strategy. So we just keep reaping the benefits, both to consumers and to businesses, from lower cost of compliance with standards and regulations. Ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I mentioned that we have rarely faced such extraordinary challenges as we do today. And rarely has there been such a great need, such great opportunities, and such potential for successful joint action as today. It's quite a difference whether we always repeat the term problems or whether we point at challenges in those times. And that's sometimes for a German also good to learn. Tough decisions await us, both in companies and in governments. They will affect jobs, wages, and pensions. They will affect government support for companies, how much, when, and under what conditions. Here again, what I had to say about moving from what was inconceivable to what is now inevitable holds true. Much, so very much, is uncertain at present. But one thing is not. We know we will only be able to tackle the current crisis together. And that means applying words like coordination, cooperation, complementarity, all of the things we have used in our speeches for years now, but now we have a chance to prove it. And we should be aware of the opportunities it contains. Sometimes it is easier to jump the hurdles when there is a crisis. And may that thought guide us as we move forward. Thank you very much.